Okay, welcome you all to this seminar of the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance. My name is Hans Asenbaum, and I'm so excited to be here today, particularly today, because it's a start of a new seminar series, an entire series of the topic of decolonizing deliberative democracy. So we all felt there's a discussion emerging in the UK, in Canberra, in Australia, in many places in our deliberative and participatory democracy community about what it means to decolonize the theories that we come from. There is a lot of reflection, I think, to be done, and it's a very necessary conversation. So I'm very much looking forward to this series. We are again a bit dispersed all over the world. A couple of us are in Europe, where it's 11 a.m. in the UK, 12 in Central Europe. It's 8 p.m. in Canberra, so we're happy that everybody in Canberra also bears with us at a later time. And since our main institution, our host institution who hosts this, this seminar, the University of Canberra, is in Canberra, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Canberra, the Ngunnawal people. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of the city and this region. And we can all take a moment wherever we are to think about the people who were here before us and what they have contributed to the culture of wherever we are at the moment. So as I said, it's the first seminar of the Decolonizing series. We have 7 seminars, which is quite exciting. I will post the link in the chat for you to sign up for the other ones as well. So we'll have quite few discussions in front of us, so we can really get our heads around this. So our first seminar is with Bobby Banerjee. We're really happy that you're here today, Bobby. I'm just quickly gonna introduce you and then hand over to you for your talk. So Bobby is Professor of Management and Associate Dean of Research and Enterprise at Bayes Business School, City University in London. He researches and teaches on corporate social irresponsibility, unsustainability, climate justice, and decolonial resistance movements. And I'm looking forward to this conversation also because it's going to be an interdisciplinary conversation. Professor Banerjee comes from the business and management perspective and engages with deliberative democracy. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you again for being here, and over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And how shall I put it? The engagement and the interest from my Australian colleagues is fantastic. And I'm sure there are many interesting things you could do on 8 o'clock on a Tuesday than to listen to me. So it's great that you're here. Let's see if I can just share my screen. It should work. Is this okay? Can you see this okay? Yep. All right.
Yes.
This is what I'm going to talk about, is kind of distilling 2 papers into one, which runs the danger of doing a disservice to both. So, and the theory can get quite heavy, especially the decolonial kind of stuff. So I'm not going to go too much time into the theory, but if you're interested, I will send you the papers. One just is published online, I think last month, and the other one was a couple of years ago, which I am now revisiting based on new developments in the field. So I guess from my perspective, looking at decolonizing deliberative democracy, the obvious question would be, what does it mean to decolonize deliberative democracy? Why does democracy have to be to be decolonized, right? So why is there a need to do this? And from a business school perspective, it's the theories of deliberative democracy has filtered down into notions of business society relationships. So we have corporate social responsibility as a manifestation of deliberative democracy at the corporate level, right? So that's kind of the focus of the paper. The Italian filmmaker Pier Paolo Pasolini once said that every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. So inspired by him, I'm going to start with my conclusions, and then I will work my way backwards down to my introduction and the research question. So it should be fairly obvious for those of you who know this literature that it begins with a critique of the political economy of capitalism, because colonialism was and is integral to late capitalism. So thus, it is not possible to decolonize deliberative democracy under social relations of capitalism. Now, we could stop here, and this could be the shortest seminar on record and go to the bar. But what I was having this conversation with Hans, and in the UK, this has become an ice cream flavor of the month. Everybody wants to decolonize. So my school was called Cass Business School, and so John Cass, who we are named after, was an active slave trader, and we had to change the name as, again, a moment of decolonization. So my business school dean at that time asked me to head a task force on decolonizing the business school, because this was my research. And I did mention to him at the time that if you really read the literature on decolonization, it starts with the dismantling of capitalism, which is going to make for a very interesting but rapidly extinct business school. I haven't heard anything from him after that. So I guess we're still back to business as usual. So again, I'm not going to go into this theory. It comes from Latin America. For those of you who are interested, I can send you the paper. It talks about the coloniality of power, which is a key concept, which is the basis of the racialized classification of societies and constitutes the basis of modernity, right? And one of the things which I guess separates decolonial movements from other similar movements is that it has a close basis on praxis, links to subaltern social movements. It looks at decolonizing knowledge systems, state-society relationships, right? So that's pretty much where my theoretical angle comes from. But what I thought it would make it easier and make the somewhat dense theory more real is to look at actual illustrative cases which is going on in these democratic countries. And that is essentially the onus of this paper. So if you look at the notions of sovereignty which exist, European notions of sovereignty, which is the basis of international law, has its roots in colonialism, and it tends to regulate and reintroduce and reproduce notions of colonial control. So colonialism was constitutive of European notions of sovereignty, international law, and development, right? So these destructive constructions constructed these binaries of civilized, uncivilized, modern, primitive, developed, underdeveloped, right? So these binaries of civilized, barbaric, sovereignty always remained, and authority always remained on the side of the civilized and developed, right? As in all binaries, one pole tends to dominate the other. So once sovereignty was established along these dimensions, in the post-colonial era, the universal problem became, how do we create order amongst these newly sovereign states? Yeah? How do we normalize these non-European societies in using these categories, right? So these structures, essentially institutional structures like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, these structures of development, they actually enabled then this progression to modernity and development. So essentially, third world sovereignty was manufactured by the colonial world to serve its interests. And in a critique of sovereignty, then ultimately sovereignty is, if you go back to the classic political philosophy definition, sovereignty is the power to decide who lives and who dies. That's sovereign power, right? Coming down, I guess, to the more liberal version of sovereignty, it is the power then to create states of exception. And it is in the state of exception where violence can be deployed, legitimate violence. The state then is the only legitimate purveyor of violence, right? So this is the state of exception, right? Now, this violence is also deeply racialized, yeah? So indigenous people, Native Americans and slaves in the US, for example, were racialized in different ways, but with the same goal of ensuring the dominance of white settlers as legitimate occupiers. So classifying an African slave as Black or colored has material consequences for the slave owner, because if the slaves reproduced, their wealth would increase, yeah? But at the same time, it served the colonial project to racially classify indigenous Americans, Native Americans, as savages, as less than humans, because then it justified the logic of eliminating them to confiscate their lands, right? So you had two kinds of racial division, both with the same aim of occupation and land, yeah? So I look at violence in terms of way this is happening today and the last 200 years in extractive projects in mining, gas, and oil, yeah? So I study these environmental conflicts. This is a list of ongoing violent conflicts. This is not a full list. I put this because it fits on one slide. Journal editors don't like tables which go over one pages, right? I only picked violent conflicts, not because I liked violence, but because violence represents a failure of hegemony. So if the state is actively engaged in killing its own citizens in the name of development or progress or sovereignty, I think there are some lessons to be learned, right? So if you look at this list, what strikes you? Yeah. It is no accident that every country on this list is a former colony. Yeah. It is also no accident that the companies who are at the root of these conflicts or the cause of these conflicts are headquartered in London, New York, Paris, or financed in Montreal and Berlin, right? Another thing which strikes out is apart from China, Vietnam, and I think Laos, the constitutional monarchy, all these countries are quote unquote democracies, right? So I guess then the question is, in what way in liberal or non-Western liberal democracies can states kill its own citizens, with impunity, along with the market as well? Yeah. So one of the ways to solve these conflicts is through deliberation. Again, you guys are all experts in deliberative democracy. I'm not going to go through this. The paper has a review of this and also the critics. All this should be easily known to you. These criticisms are not new. I guess the only thing I wanted to add here was this the racialized notion and the decolonial notion of these. So we all know that the Enlightenment reason, the rationality, which is the basis of liberal democracies, does not pose the question is why was the enslavement of non-European races considered to be an acceptable practice by most Enlightenment thinkers? Yeah. So while we were proclaiming freedom and the inalienable rights of humans, slavery was also being practiced. So while the Enlightenment has enabled emancipation, human rights, democracy, and freedom, which the much celebrated exercise of reason, is the same reason which has also led to colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. Yeah. So Enlightenment rationality is deeply embedded in the idea of empire, whose mission involved political subjugation of those it sought to empower and civilize, right? So this much celebrated use of reason also creates forms of domination, which is even more insidious than coercive power, because these forms of domination now are vindicated by reason. Yeah. So the notion of power and authority, the factor of consensus, is also a form of hegemony, also a stabilization of power, right? So we talk about a democracy without choices, where the real policies we have very little influence on, except to change political parties who increasingly resemble each other. Yeah. So the fact that legitimacy is not automatic, legitimacy doesn't come from God. Legitimacy is also an outcome of certain relations of power. So these basic assumptions of deliberative democracy have been filtered down to the notion in corporate social responsibility, to a notion called political CSR, which they try to distinguish from CSR, which I find a bit pointless because CSR is also political. I mean, what is not political? Everything is political, but let's not go there. It's a different argument. So this has been defined as a deliberative movement of the corporation into the political sphere in order to respond to environmental and social challenges. So an example would be this statement by then the CEO and chairman of the board for the Ford Motor Company, a descendant of Henry Ford, who talked about corporations should be and could be a major force for resolving environmental and social concerns in the 21st century. Also echoed by the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, who, when he was launching his United Nations Global Compact, talked about a happy convergence. He was talking to the Fortune 500 CEOs, happy convergence between what your shareholders want and what is best for millions of people. Now, I don't know which millions of people Kofi Annan has been talking to, but I can think of millions, if not a billion, where the opposite is true, where instead of a happy convergence, a wealth is extracted from the bodies of millions of people at their expense for the benefit of very few, right? So I don't think that this happy convergence exists, except in the minds of political CSR theorists, right? So my take is slightly different. I would define political CSR as an ideological movement designed to legitimize and consolidate the power of multinational corporations. Just as many decolonial scholars would say that deliberative democracy is an ideological movement designed to legitimize and consolidate the power of local elites. So the emergence of the neoliberal state, in the 1980s resulted in transforming the state from a regulator of the economy to one that provides and maintains the institutional and material conditions which is required for the expansion of capital, right? And they do this through increased state surveillance and repression. So this neoliberal shift, which happened in the 80s, was a shift from governance to a coalition of private actors on governance, right? So what this tends to do is the laws governing the extraction of public resources, extraction of natural resources, results in legitimizing political frameworks of governance that are not democratic, which further marginalize segments of the population who do not have access to these new structures of power. So if you look at the violence that goes around the extraction of resources, we all know where these are where the conflicts are happening. We all know where the extraction are coming. We also know where it's going, right? This, for example, it's forced labor and child labor in the Congo. This would be protest in Mexico. This would be in Guatemala, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Dakota Access Pipeline projects in North America and the US. This is in Marikina in South Africa, where 34 unarmed miners were shot by police in 2012. This is in the Peruvian Amazon. I guess you could probably call this a form of deliberation or stakeholder engagement, but you won't find that in too many textbooks. So alarmed by this, the United Nations Human Rights Council, they formed a special rapporteur to investigate these killings of indigenous peoples and environmental defenders. And this was their report, which was released in 2013. The emphasis is mine. The business model that still prevails in most of these places is not fully conducive to the fulfillment of indigenous people's rights, particularly the self-determination. They had to say, the further went to say in the report, that many corporations do not commit to more than compliance. There are significant imbalances in power between indigenous peoples and mining companies, and states pay little systematic attention to these power imbalances, right? So this was a report. Now, again, this is not something which just happened during colonial times, it's happening even now. About 20, 23, 24 years ago, my gosh, that's long, when I was living in Australia, I wrote a paper on the conflict in the construction of the Jabiluka uranium mine. And I was doing a lot of archival research then, apart from interviewing people. And this is one of the first Australian commissioned reports on expanding mining. And again, the emphasis is mine. I'm not going to read the whole thing out. This is a consultation they did with Aboriginal communities on expanding mining in the 70s, and was the basis of Australia's policy on mining. So they said that the impression is that they would happily forego the lot in exchange for an assurance that mining would not proceed. In the end, we formed the conclusion that their opposition should not be allowed to prevail. So who is the we? Who is the they? what kind of relations of capital, colonialism inform those interactions. Yeah. And this is again an outcome of a deliberative consultation process on mining, right? Now, for indigenous people in the settler colonies, Western notions of sovereignty represent power, imperialism, and the unrelenting exercise of colonialism, right? Where citizenship becomes coercive, a forced assimilation into the white settler normative framework. So native title in Australia was recognized by the colonial state precisely because it gave the state the power to extinguish it, right? So native title essentially was invented, was recognized to serve the interests of mining companies. And a similar discourse was seen in North America and Canada and the US, where they had treaties, but the treaties were a way to access lands which they could not access by force, right? Through a series of land cessation technologies, right? Then also alarmed by this, this was a 15, 20-year struggle. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed over about 10 years ago, and they talked about free, prior, and informed consent. And they talked about how consultation has to be in good faith, right? That you need free consent, informed consent, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, exploitation of mineral, water, other resources. Now, this declaration, as I said, was bitterly opposed, vigorously opposed by Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, the countries responsible, I guess, for the most genocide of indigenous peoples. After a lot of pressure, they reluctantly accepted it with a lot of caveats. Australia says this is just aspirational, it doesn't mean anything. The US says it is legally not binding, right? So it's been accepted, but it means very little, except on a piece of paper, right? So the US tried to engage with this and came up with their own definition of what they called free, prior, and informed consent, where they talked about, again, the emphasis is mine, recognizes the significance. We understand that we need to consult, but not necessarily the agreement of those leaders. So this also, again, makes a mockery of why would you consult when you don't need the agreement of the leaders? So a project can still go ahead if the leaders don't agree, tribal leaders, which again makes a mockery of any kind of consultation. But this is, again, the problems in deliberation at the corporate level. And as I said, this is not 200 years ago. This is happening now. This was the Dakota Access Pipeline resistance movement. I'm not sure how many of you know this in detail. It's a $4 billion project, a 1,000-mile line pipeline, which goes through Indian land, Native American land, of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. It goes through their sacred sites, their burial grounds, and also of crucial importance through the water supply. And it has a risk of contaminating the water supply in case of an oil leak. Those risks were not exaggerated. Already there have been 4 major leaks which have contaminated the wetlands, right? After years of deliberation, where the recurring objections of tribal leaders were either ignored, lawsuits which were unsuccessful, protesters decided on direct action and occupied the land. For the first time in more than 250 years, all 7 bands of the Sioux Nation came together to conduct ceremonies to protect their land and water. The last time these bands had gathered together was when Abraham Lincoln was president. And ironically, they had gathered there together to protest the same thing they're protesting now. It is the theft of their land, right? So the treaties, as I said, did not recognize explicitly the political sovereignty of indigenous nations. It was a strategy carried out for land cessations, right? So this process required an enforceable system of individual property rights, which is the cornerstone of liberal democracies, right? So settlers can hold private property in perpetuity, yeah? Whereas indigenous occupancy is temporary. So collective ownership can be extinguished for private ownership, but not the other way around, yeah? You cannot extinguish private ownership for collective ownership, right? That's the fundamental basis. So the DAPL protest was not just a fight about water rights, about land rights. It was about livelihood struggle. It was a struggle for a way of living. How did the state react to this peaceful protest. It wasn't an armed rebellion by its citizens. Cowboys and Indians all over again. Very little has changed. Yeah. So these protests were violently quelled by militarized police and private security forces. Armored cars, rubber bullets, mace, water cannons, attack dogs, tear gas, concussion grenades, armed drones, helicopters. I've been to my fair share of protests in the US. I was invited to speak at the Occupy Wall Street protests, where over 3,000 people were arrested. It's mainly a white movement. I have not seen these tactics used by the American state against white protesters. I didn't see any attack dogs or militarized drones or armored vehicles across George Washington Bridge where the protests were happening, right? So it's difficult to see, not to see the racialized nature of how the state uses to quell certain protests, yeah? And the tribal leaders also pointed to the racial injustice of the project itself. The original proposal for the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was the most efficient and shortest way, was to route the pipeline through a town called Bismarck. Bismarck is a town whose population is 92% white. And the town meetings council got together and through a series of deliberative democratic processes, came to a consensus, peaceful consensus, that the line should not pass through Bismarck, but instead should go through Indian lands. That was the outcome of a deliberative process in the town. Yeah, so very easy to see, I guess, the colonial structures in this. And this also made it more interesting because the market and state collusion was apparent. So the owners of the pipeline, the Energy Transfer Partners, they hired a private security firm, Tiger Swan, to conduct surveillance of activists, right? So when the state and business collude to legitimately provide violence, then that democracy, deliberative or otherwise, has to be questioned. Yeah. So it kind of makes this mockery of the Habermasian argument of the unforced force of the better argument. Why use the unforced force of the better argument when force alone will suffice, which is what's pretty much happening all over the world. Yeah. So the Indian wars in North America have never ended. So this Sioux protest, Dakota, is a continuation of a long history of oppression and resistance. Yeah. So in the context of the indigenous political economy, yeah, decolonization is not about equity. It's not about inclusion or social justice. Yeah. Not even a fight against oppression. It is ultimately about the repatriation of indigenous land and making decolonization accountable to indigenous sovereignty. Now that makes a lot of deliberative Democrats fairly uncomfortable. What does it mean then for repatriation of land in Australia, in Canada, in the US? Yeah? There's another conflict. This is in India, which I had also written about. It's an indigenous community in the east coast of Odisha, in the east state of Odisha, where Vedanta Corporation was building an aluminum oxide mine on the mountains to feed its refinery in the valley. A small group, maybe 250 people, got together. Major protest. It became a global protest, and finally they overturned the decision to mine on that land. It was a small victory. So if you look at how this conflict played out, this is a statement from the mission statement from the annual report of the company. Talked about Vedanta. We believe our strategy will harness India's high quality wealth of mineral resources. Again, nothing wrong with this argument. Perfectly legitimate argument. India, despite what you see on television, is still a very poor country. And obviously, natural resource and resource exporting is a huge source of wealth and revenue for developing countries. So nobody can argue with this statement. Mining creates jobs, creates wealth through royalties, taxation. The problem is when it comes to land access, Niamgiri is the name of the mountain. This is the tribal leader, one of the tribal leader rather, talked about without Niamgiri, we cannot think of life. It is our soul. Now, I don't know about you guys, but high school economics will tell you the mountain, the use of a soul is not a very efficient use of the mountain, right? What is the net present value of a soul, right? But here's the problem. This guy is right as well. Even the chairman of Vedanta is not going to disagree with the statement. He says, yes, these are tribal people. They have a different religion. They worship this God. They've been living here for 40,000 years. We have no problem with this, right? So this person is right, just as the CEO of Vedanta is right. What happens when we have two rights? So as a wise man taught us a couple of 100 years ago, when you have two rights, force decides. And that's pretty much what happened, is the state sends in its army and its police to quell any kind of protest, right? Because contrary to the premise of the global economic paradigm, it is impossible, right, to have one universal metric for comparing and exchanging the real values of nature amongst different groups of people from different cultures. So there is no amount of deliberation, consultation, engagement, which is going to solve this outcome. Either there is a mind which displaces people, or there is no mind, right? There is simply no way of reaching consensus about how mining shall proceed. Yeah. So what then are the implications, I guess, of these arguments? One of the things about democracy is its paradoxical link with sovereignty. So one cannot imagine democracy without sovereignty. But the problem is, when you use sovereignty to protect democracy, the opposite happens. So Derrida talks about an autoimmune logic, where to preserve in itself the thing that both defines it and can then destroy it. So sovereignty is co-opted by democracy, yeah, to immunize and protect itself from destruction. But it can only do so by deploying a sovereignty which is based on exclusion, which denies difference, which is again the opposite of democratic principles in the first place. Yeah. So here's the paradox between democracy and sovereignty. But in that paradox, there is also, I guess, some level of a lack of closure, like in any paradox. Because of this lack of closure, it allows perhaps to imagine a form of democracy to come, in a way. And what could that look like, right? So this democracy to come is not just about a temporality, but perhaps different spaces for intervention, for dialogue, for resistance, perhaps even for deliberation in a different way. So the real question then is, how should the state then respond to increased demands for autonomy from disaffected population, right? And again, if you take, India is the shining example of democracy. This is happening all over in India. And the response is very clear, is violence, it's occupation, right? Any demand for this kind of some kind of autonomy is met with state violence in democracies. And we are seeing the same all over South America, and also in the Dakota Access Pipeline project, which I talked about as well. Yeah. So one way I try to make sense of the space of the democracy to come, and this is a different paper, much earlier paper, where I talk about the notion of the translocal. These are specific local spaces across multiple nation states, involving different configurations of identities, authorities, rights, and resources. Yeah. These tend to have horizontal and lateral networks compared to the vertical networks that are a feature of nation-state governance of the WTO and IMF. Multi-level forms of governance, different forms of authority as well to an extent. A prevalence of private actors, not just state actors. So a lot of NGOs, for example, in the space as well. These are relations with heterogeneous or contingent, unstable, they constantly change. Dissent is a key factor in translocality. It's not consensus, it's dissent and coexistence. And agency also is diffused. It's not just that communities have or do not have agency, and the states do. There's a diffusion. The notion of also juxtaposed temporalities. The example I gave you of the mountain as a source of bauxite, a source of a mine, has a temporality of the nation state, of development, of progress, right? The mountain as a soul, the mountain as my ancestor, has a different temporality of the indigenous space-time, of different cosmology, right? So the same mountain is looked at with different temporalities through an indigenous way of looking at it, and I guess a modernistic development way of looking at it. And I guess this notion of democracy is also needs to be questioned. Is this obsession with democracy, I guess, can be understood, which I find surprising, because all the institutions that govern our lives are not democratic. Yeah, the World Bank is not democratic. The United Nations is not democratic. The World Trade Organization is not democratic. Yeah? The church is not democratic. Universities are not democratic. So pretty much everything that governs our life are not democracies in a way. But I guess still there is a need to see how our rights can be exercised. Yeah. So finally, and this is where I'm not going to get into this detail again. Journal editors like tables, so I have this. If you're interested, I'll send you the paper. Try and distinguish between deliberative corporate social responsibility and my notion of translocal governance, where, like I said, the goal is not consensus, but how dissent is allowed and enabled, and also notion of coexistence. So different sources of legitimacy, different sources of political rights, different negotiation outcomes, different shapes of networks, different, this is a key notion. Property rights are not individual. Property rights are communal, which can be quite problematic in many ways. The outcomes is disruption in many ways. CSR is a form of hegemonic accommodation. And I talked about the different temporalities of that kind of governance. So as I said, as I promised, I said, I'm going to end with some implications and questions. So political CSR then, I argue, is a hegemonic accommodation to dominant interest. It is not a consensus outcome. And instead, translocal governance, where the goal is not consensus, but coexistence, self-determination, and autonomy at one level. And this requires an engagement, not just an acknowledgement of different cosmologies, of which Western universalism is just one of different sources of knowledge, right? I guess at one level, what the normative goal would be what the Zapatistas called a pluriverse, which is not an inclusive democracy, but a world in which many worlds can exist, as un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, a world which many worlds can exist, as opposed to a universal democracy of equality, diversity, and inclusion, right? So as I said, I was going to end with my research questions. I'm not going to read this out. I started with my conclusion, right? So nearly 40 years ago, the Black feminist writer, poet, and activist Audre Lorde famously said, "The master's tools will never destroy the master's house." That is true. And as far as decolonization is concerned, the master's tools are diversity, equality, and inclusion. Those tools will never destroy the master's house. But if our masters, and by our masters, I mean the power structures that control our lives, the power structures in our schools, our universities, yeah? Power structures that are almost exclusively white, male, heterosexual, and patriarchal. If these power structures have opened the door of the house even a little bit, then hell yeah, let's use whatever intellectual tools we have to break the whole goddamn door down. The we here being Black people, people of color, indigenous peoples, and their white accomplices. Why? Because as the Black Lives Matter movement says, that's not a chip on my shoulder, that's your foot on my neck. As the post-colonial migrants say, we are here because you were there. And as the indigenous peoples in the settler colonies say, we were always here. So thank you for your time and attention. And I hope I was on time, and I'll be happy to take any questions.